When I say rave, I'm meaning specifically European style techno music. I mean, there'd be movie stars everywhere, porn stars, Playboy models. I mean, it was like that kind of a crowd. So I got essentially recruited through my friend's older brother. I mean, we had like a half a dozen guys working the dance floor. We had one guy holding the product with one of our friends watching his back, another guy holding the money. We had like a 10-man team. We left that night with almost $60,000.
Originally started out late 80s with ecstasy. Now, I do want to highlight before we get too deep into this, your life rights have basically been optioned. They're doing a documentary, and I think possibly a movie is in the works. So we can't divulge like every single thing, but I think you're going to be able to give us enough broad strokes just to kind of give us a good primer on the things that took place, because there's a lot of players here in this, some that people will know if you're in the LA area, and a really famous song that we're going to cover that's almost a snitch album, I guess, if you will. So let's get right into it, man. Let break it down. Take us back to the late 80s in the scene where you were at. What were you involved in? How was it going on? Break it down for us.
Well, ecstasy was originally declared illegal in 1985. It was subjected to a number of court challenges, administrative challenges. And so like the FDA, it was scheduled as a controlled substance in 1988. And that was the progenitor of what later on prompted what became the rave scene, because 1988 was very important in Los Angeles, because that was the year where Los Angeles style hip hop really broke through. Like up until that point, you had a few years of, hip hop gaining a little bit of popularity, but it was primarily New York acts, whether it was, Run DMC, Eric B. and Rakim, Beastie Boys, of course.
Right.
And in 1988, you had NWA Straight Outta Compton. And that really galvanized the music scene on the West Coast. And so now 1988 was also a very important year for me personally, because at the time, early that year, I got introduced to an individual named John Ellenberger. Now, John was older. At the time, I was 18 years old. One of my best friends was my friend Johnny, who I knew from high school. Well, Johnny had an older brother, Joey, who was friends with John. And so essentially you had John and Joey going to nightclubs. You had me and Johnny going to high school parties. Like, we really didn't associate with the older guys, but they'd be like, these were my buddy's older brother's friend. Well, he ultimately, later on, he turned out to be the drug trafficker, who at that point was primarily just, moderate cocaine trafficker. He was, he was living in the Newport Beach area. He was your quintessential rich kid. Like, grew up driving his daddy's Ferraris to high school, 7,000 square foot house, private airplane. His dad owned a racing team, associated with the, prestigious medical university. And so he was essentially the rich kid who went bad boy.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, he dropped out of USC, but his whole little network of drug associates were other rich kids, and they were essentially, single kilo traffickers. But if you've got like 7 or 8 guys, you're picking up 8 or 9 at a time. So one to this guy, 2 to that guy. So it starts adding up a little bit, and so by the time we meet him, he's 23. To us, he's a big drug dealer, because I really didn't know any significant drug dealers. And although ultimately he wasn't significant, later on he certainly would be. But at this point, he was significant to 18-year-olds.
Right.
And the reason why it was important for this guy is because he, and along with his other friends, they would travel over to Europe a lot. So they would go party in Ibiza. Like, they would go to what was in Europe called raves, which were essentially ecstasy and techno music style driven parties. That wasn't a phenomenon that was really happening here in the United States at the time. Right around that late 80s, like 88, you had the first raves beginning in what was predominantly in New York and on the East Coast. And when I say rave, I'm meaning specifically European style techno music. Like we didn't even have the term techno at the time. We didn't use the word rave, and we didn't use the word techno. You know, these were underground clubs where acid house music or house music was being played. Later on, it became known as techno a few years later. And so as a consequence of my friend's older brother running around with this rich kid who had been introduced to rave culture, we started getting these underground clubs in Los Angeles, which were predominantly hip hop parties. Like these weren't no raves at all. Like, you know, the New York parties were essentially like white guys from Europe throwing techno parties. In LA, it was just all street guys from South Central. You know, these were guys that were like, quite frankly, for the most part, like small-time drug dealers or like lower-level wholesalers who loved hip-hop and, you know, were aspiring hip-hop artists. And they made money. They threw underground clubs as a side hustle, essentially. Right. And in Los Angeles, we've always had this real interesting symbiotic relationship between very affluent whites, like living up in the Beverly Hills area, enjoying this like vicarious thrill of going into predominantly Black communities to attend parties. That was like a measure of like street credibility almost. And so the initial underground clubs were thrown in what were the old industrial sections of Los Angeles. You know, today we think of LA as, you know, entertainment industry, financial markets, that kind of thing. Well, back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, one of the main industries LA was built upon was aviation, both commercial and military. So when you think of an old World War II movie, you see those squadrons like B-29 bombers, B-17s, B-25s. All that was built in Los Angeles. We have literally hundreds, if not a few thousand, old warehouses, old airplane hangars. I mean, they're talking like literally sprawled throughout the city, from Long Beach all the way up, you know, past Hawthorne through up into Inglewood. You know, we're talking late 80s, essentially. There's like literally hundreds of these scattered over a 50-mile area.
Right.
So that provides an opportunity where, you know, essentially what the DJs would do is they would identify one of these warehouses, break into it, bootleg the electricity, throw up some lights, throw down some tables to have, you know, for the makeshift bar, bring in some DJ equipment, and they would just start promoting the party. And so what was really captivating about these parties was, first of all, like if you were in the in crowd, like the entertainment industry crowd, because when we used to go to these, I was 19 when I started going. I mean, there'd be movie stars everywhere, porn stars, Playboy models. I mean, it was like that kind of a crowd. You know, I mean, you see like this real high, successful strata of the entertainment industry, essentially going into South Central LA. They're going into Inglewood for a rave.
Right.
And what was great about those parties is that if you weren't in the in crowd, like for us, I grew up in West Covina, which is about 20 miles outside of LA, maybe 35 miles outside of Beverly Hills. And so, you know, we were just a bedroom community out in the San Gabriel Valley.
Right.
And so you had to, there was a phone number that you would call. They called it the bat line. And you'd call the bat line, like it starts, as you can call them after 7. And they would give you, they wouldn't tell you the location to where to go by the map. They would give you clues that you had to use to figure out the first map point. And so like, I'll never forget, like the first time I called it, they're like, okay, it's on H&A. So they give you the first letter of the streets in Los Angeles where you had to go to the map point. And so of course, not being actually in Los Angeles, being out in the valley, I would know, me and my friends, we'd have like a big map, you know, city streets of LA maps sprawled out across the table. And now we're looking, okay, H&A. So it's like, and you're looking for all the big main thoroughfares, like, oh, Harbor Boulevard. Oh, Adams Street. Like, you know what I mean? Like you're going through the map. Harbor, Adams. So then you're calling your brother, Harbor and Adams. And, you know, so then they had to get to Harbor and Adams. And then there's going to be a guy standing there. There's some black guy just standing there. And you pull up and you ask him, hey, trying to get a map. Got to give him $20. He gives you a coin. Sends you to a second. This is how they filter to make sure you weren't cops.
Yeah.
Right? So we'd go from one map point to the second map point. Then you get, you know, like, you know, and then you get, of course, the second map, and it give you coded directions on how to get to the location. And, you know, think about it. Like if you're 19 years old, you and 3 or 4 of your buddies, you're like on a total adventure at this point. You know what I mean? You're traveling through sections of the city you normally never go into. You're meeting strange people. You know what I mean? It was just like these wonderful experiences as a young guy, just tracking down these clubs. And, when the rich kid John had approached my friends and I, it was principally through me, because he had his friend Joey's younger brother had John, Johnny was the most popular guy in our circle, most popular guy out of 2 high schools, essentially. And so when John looked at his friend Joey's younger brother and his circle of friends, he saw sales force. Because if you're going to market ecstasy at this point, because John would go to Europe, he had taken ecstasy. Like, he didn't do drugs, he didn't smoke, he never did lines, he wasn't even really a big drinker, but he loved ecstasy. And so when he got involved with dealing ecstasy, he wanted to market it at the retail level. And this was his insight, because he had a friend of his named Aria whom he could buy wholesale quantities of ecstasy from. But if you're buying it at the wholesale level at, like, let's say $8 a dose, and you're flipping it for $10 a dose, you're making $2 a dose.
Yeah.
But if you can market it at the retail level to nightclub crowds, that's $20 a dose. If you can market it at the underground crowd, that's $25 a dose. So even after paying those sales force worker bees, how I started out, you got paid $5 a dose. So if I sold 300 doses that night, you make $1,500. Well, when you're 19 years old, you're making $1,500 on Wednesday night. You're making $1,000 on Thursday night. You're making $1,000. I mean, keep in mind also, we're talking $1989, $1990.
Yeah, hell, that's good money now.
Yeah, so if you're making, $3,500 a week in 1990, today that's like $9,000.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so we had that's how you had this whole group of like 20-year-olds all of a sudden start coming into cash, because we initially started marketing ecstasy pills at the retail level. And then once my buddy John had moved from Newport Beach to Beverly Hills in the autumn of 1989, he started networking in with these in-crowd people and started learning about these underground clubs. So we started going to these underground clubs like late that summer, early autumn. And again, this is at the time, they weren't really big clubs. You'd have like maybe 700 people, 800 people.
Mm-hmm.
But, the clubs would start at, let's say, 12:30 in the morning, 1 o'clock in the morning, and they'd peak about 4, and they'd end up, the cops would show up and break them up around sometime like 5:30 in the morning. Well, this was a high drug consumption crowd. Particularly for like the late 80s, you're paying $25 to get in. There was like no nightclubs in LA charging $25. So you had to pay $25 to get into the rave, to the underground club. They're selling, you could either buy a styrofoam cup of vodka or a styrofoam cup of tequila. This isn't top shelf stuff. It's like gallons of vodka. And they're just, and they're charging you $5 for a Dixie cup of something. So they're just making money hand over fist. And, there was open drug consumption. There were tables, people just doing lines right there. It was just a totally different world, particularly for someone like myself, because, growing up, I wasn't really one of the cool kids. Like, I didn't develop a measure of popularity until my senior year in high school. For the first few years, I'd moved from Chicago to LA. I was, amongst my peer group, I was considered a, computer geek. I was a nerd. I was a computer geek who played piano, essentially. So, coming from that background, California's gifted student program, I wasn't exposed to open drug use and, bombshell strippers out partying with their drug dealer boyfriends. You know what I mean? Like this is an entirely different crowd than I was normally accustomed to. And so that's where we started marketing the ecstasy pills at the retail level, because I was able to get $25 a dose.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And I'm selling, 400 doses there. So I'm making 10 grand that night. I'm taking home $2,000. My buddy's making $8,000. Like, these are just very lucrative. And so after about the third one of these underground clubs, during that last year, right before my senior year in high school, like during the latter half of my junior year, I got involved with DJing parties. And I grew up in a middle-class community that was, primarily white and Hispanic. But it was like on the nicer end of the Hispanic scale. You didn't have like any Chicano street gang guys. You know what I mean? It was a little bit, it's the areas where cartel operatives operate. People think that the cartel guys operate in lower middle class Hispanic communities. They're never in there.
Yeah.
They don't want to deal with the street gang element whatsoever. And so that's why later on, some of the people that I just happened to know were individuals that surprisingly were living like up in South Hills, where you would never think be doctors, lawyers, accountants, and then all of a sudden, drug kingpin. And but it was I had gotten involved with DJing parties, and there were probably a half a dozen African American kids at our school, and one of the like 5 or 6 guys that were there, I was good friends with. And so like he got involved with DJing parties, and so him and I collaborated quite a bit. I would throw a lot of business his way, and he would actually DJ the parties in the lower middle class area. Like I'd throw parties in the nicer areas because I didn't want the gang element to show up, because they fight and cops are going to come. They're going to break up the party. They're going to impound my equipment. You know what I mean? Like, so I focus more on the upper middle class, lower upper class segments. Whereas a lot of them people, even at the nicer schools, they're not going to call a black guy to throw the parties. Mm-hmm. Like they call me, even though I'm Latino, most people just think I'm white. And so like I would throw a lot of business his way. Anyhow, long story short, him and I became really good friends. His cousin, he would have to call security sometimes to come, be bouncers at his parties. One of his cousins was this guy out of Inglewood. Nickname was Bear. Well, 6'3", 245. We're 18. Bear's like, 24 years old, but just huge. So he'd show up with like 3 or 4 of his guys. And he provided security at some of the parties that my buddy would throw. And I got to know the cousin well. I'd be at some of the family functions and stuff. Well, later on, when I started going to raves or the underground clubs initially, Bear provided security at the clubs. Like the production company that threw the famous one in the late 80s was a place called The Boot. And The Boot moved every week. So you'd have to call the bat line. They'd give you the initials for you to find the location to go find The Boot. So sometimes you'd be in Inglewood, sometimes you'd be in Compton, sometimes all over South Central.
Yeah.
And predominantly African-American communities, black DJs, black guys providing security. Well, I had a number of these circumstances in the first few years of my ecstasy trafficking activity where I ended up developing a connection that really moved the ball forward. And the first one was Bear. So I was like my second or third one of these parties where I saw him. So I walk over. Now he's like, hey, what's going on? Blah, blah, blah. So next thing you know, like I didn't have to deal with the bat line anymore. Like I got the inside plug. I got introduced to one of the DJs. And the fact that I was selling ecstasy, they were thrilled. Like they didn't even ask for any of the money. They're just like, hey, bring the product.
Yeah.
Because they're already selling coke there. But they didn't have access to ecstasy, and ecstasy was the hot new drug amongst the younger crowd. So if I could bring that to their parties, they're thrilled that I'm bringing it. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And so like, let's say that first year, let's say 1989, you had a number of these underground clubs where I had started distributing ecstasy at. Now by early 1990, you started getting a few of these European style raves popping up in LA, but they didn't attract, the entertainment industry crowd. LA is, as much as I love Los Angeles, it's somewhat of a little bit of a superficial city in that it's driven by status.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like you had status if you knew where the parties were. Just being there. That way you're just a lame. You don't know about it. Like, I've seen how the rich people really denigrate one another by, putting on airs essentially. And the raves that were beginning in the early 90s weren't really the cool parties. It was like the island of misfit toys, essentially. You know what I mean? Like the big money guys were the black guys in South Central. Now, what changed things was in the spring of 1990, there was a European style rave in New York where unfortunately there was a fire at the place. Remember, they're breaking into warehouses over there. And right. The thing about these warehouses, they're not designed to hold 1,000 people.
Right.
You park a fleet of 30 trucks in there, 30 vans or 40 moving trucks or whatever the hell it is. The exits are not rated for immediate evacuation to 900 kids, right. Or people in their late teens, early 20s. And unfortunately, like 70 kids, 80 people, 70 or 80 unalives as a consequence of this warehouse fire in New York. That's what really brought the rave thing to the attention of the American population, because back in in 1990, we had 3 networks for news and CNN. And the world, as far as the media was concerned, New York was the center of the world. So right. A fire of that nature in New York, given this new circumstance, raves, really garnered a lot of media attention, even so far as Los Angeles. So the term rave was associated with underground clubs, whereas in Los Angeles, it had never been associated with underground clubs. And so that's how you kind of got this adoption of rave to encompass a phenomenon that in LA we hadn't really accepted or embraced. And as a consequence of that event in New York, our mayor in Los Angeles at the time was a guy named Tom Bradley. Bradley had made a big public pronouncement where he had brought in LAPD, brought in the regulatory agencies, the fire department, alcohol beverage control, and instructed them, we don't want that happening in Los Angeles. Shut down all the underground clubs. And so you had a concerted effort by the authorities to target the underground clubs, which up until that point had been primarily African-American based hip hop underground parties. This gave the opening to the ravers because they began they began renting like auditoriums, which is something, like a young black drug dealer from LA isn't going to go rent the Shrine Auditorium.
Right.
They're just going to go break into a warehouse. You know what I mean? And so that spring and summer of 1990, it fundamentally changed the underground scene because there were 4 of what were traditionally raves, all European style music, European DJs, like all white guys throwing parties, listening to music that were popular in Germany and Britain and just Sweden, essentially. And those raves changed things in the sense that not all of them were held in large venues. So like the Academy Awards is oftentimes used to be held in the Shrine Auditorium. Well, there was a rave thrown there at the Shrine Auditorium called Love, Sex, Dance, LSD. Right. And it's like 3,500, 4,000 people, like 3 times, if not 4 times bigger than the biggest underground club. And when we worked that particular rave, we left that night with almost $60,000.
Damn.
And again, we're talking $1990. That's like $140,000 for a bunch of 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds. I mean, we had like a half a dozen guys working the dance floor. We had one guy holding the product with one of our friends watching his back, another guy holding the money, one of his, we had like a 10-man team working this rave, and we'd get to the party, we'd take off our shirts, and we had the fluorescent day glow paint. We would spray paint X's across our chests. And so we just walked through the crowd because these weren't bootleg warehouses. They had actual laser light shows and lighting. So they'd have like all the fluorescent lightings. So all you would see would be the fluorescent X's walking through the crowd. Doink, 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 doink. And, like I said, that changed things for us. On a personal level, it was very disappointing because from the very inception, I couldn't stand techno music. Like I despised the music. I didn't particularly care for the culture. It was it wasn't the smoking hot strippers out partying with their drug dealer boyfriends. It was like hot girls from the Valley or hot girls from Orange County. But it wasn't the fake breasts and high heels crowd.
Right.
Like I've always had like good girlfriends, but a lot of the women on the side were, smoking hot, but a little bit slutty.
Yeah.
And so going out to clubs, that's what you're looking for. You're 21 years old. You're looking for the smoking hot hotties. You're not looking for, the girls wearing tracksuits with high heel, with like tennis shoes because they danced all night. The ravers would show up at midnight. They're dancing till 5, like no heels, no fake tits, no skimpy outfits. Like, but it was a high consumption crowd.
Right.
And so so we started going to these raves despite my not particularly caring for it. We sold a bunch of, the first, like one of the raves was called Sex. Another one was LSD, Love, Sex, Dance. Another one was Love. The last one was Stranger Than Fiction. And by the time Stranger Than Fiction came around, rave culture had completely overtaken the underground club scene. Like from that point forward, let's say September of 90 on, the term underground clubs were associated with raves.
And this is like a gold mine for you because you're selling ecstasy and you're getting all these, hundreds of thousands of people in one spot with probably ample amounts of money to be able to buy it. So this is like the best thing ever.
Remember, like I said, this was a crowd of kids who were, again, I was 20 years old and I'm dealing with, most of the girls were Orange County girls. You know, they grew up in Newport Beach. They grew up in Laguna Beach. They grew up in Laguna Niguel. Or they grew up in the Valley. They're from Calabasas. They're from Woodland Hills or La Quinata. Like just all these, you know, I mean, it's like, so they all had money.
Yeah.
You know, and see, and that was for me, like when I got involved with trafficking the ecstasy, and, you know, as a personal characteristic, I'm not someone who has to be out front.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like I said, for the first few years, like I wasn't one of the cool kids. You know what I mean? I developed a measure of popularity because I had some friends that were cool, and my popularity was derivative. Right. You know, then I started throwing really good parties. And so then that kind of became like, oh, okay, he's the party guy, essentially. So like I was always comfortable with having other people take all the credit. What I do is optimize. You know, if you're in an operation, you're moving 6 or 7 or 8 keys a week. Well, after we're done optimizing, it's 30, 40, or 50. You know what I mean? Like I'm the guy you bring in to take it from 6 to 10.
Right.
You know, and I have no problem standing back, let you take all the credit, just make sure the money's right.
Yeah.
And so,
that's the way to be.
You know, and so on the ecstasy side, like I said, I got brought in because John was disappointed the way the original retail operation was ran. You know, and my buddy's older brother, who knew me as one of his younger brother's best friends, he's like, well, look, I got one of my brother's friends. We'll call him Pierre. Like I throw all the parties, I do all the logistics, I plan the vacations, I organize all the trips. He's like, he's the organizer in the group, bring him on. You know, so I got essentially recruited through my friend's older brother. And when I started dealing ecstasy, you have to understand, I was literally going up to strangers. You know, and when I started, I didn't start at the underground clubs. I'm going to regular nightclubs. Mm-hmm. So I had a fake ID. I'm going in so I'm there underage. I didn't look 20, much less, 24 like my ID said. You know, and so in order for me to protect myself, as I was approaching strangers, what I did is I figured that back in the late 80s, 1989, at least 90% of the police officers in LA were men. Mm-hmm. The overwhelming majority, of course, were white, but the majority of the police officers, I'm talking like 90+%, were men. And so in order to make sure I didn't stumble upon just a cop on an off-duty cop or an undercover cop, what I did is I focused my approaches on women. Like I only spoke to females. And most of the girls I'm attacking, I'm approaching are pretty girls.
Yeah.
I'm not saying there aren't attractive women in law enforcement, but they're not the girls hanging out at nightclubs in Hollywood.
Right. And it's a win-win. You either get to sell some product,
like I said, and also,
communicate.
And, it was, for me, it was also being a little bit of an introvert. It gave me a crutch to approach. Like normally I wouldn't be the guy approaching the girls, but now I had to, because I'm like, hey, come here, girl, let me talk to you. Hey, come here, blondie. Hey, come here, sweetheart. Like I'm approaching them about the product. I'm not approaching them about me. Yeah. So by the end of the night, I'm talking to 400, 500, 600 women a night.
Yeah.
So you could develop a comfort approaching women.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? And, of course, it increases the probability of hooking up with somebody. And so, it was like a win-win-win. I was essentially getting paid to go out to nightclubs to talk to women. Like we had guys lining up around the block in West Covina getting in on the section. Yeah. You know what I mean? Particularly you're making $1,000 and $2,000 a night to go out drinking all night and talk to chicks. Like, come on, man. What kind of a job is that? Yeah, I'm in.
Yeah.
So all my high school buddies just started jumping on board this. And so by focusing primarily on the women, I got to discover that most of the female crowd for the raves were different. They weren't the models that moved, the hot chick from Madison, Wisconsin who came to LA thinking she's going to be an actor. Instead, it's just some drunken chick from Laguna. Mm-hmm. So it was like a very different crowd. And once the rave element took over, they started throwing just these big parties at these rented auditoriums. And then they started throwing like the underground ones also. And so I was ultimately able to negotiate an arrangement with my buddy John, who, like I said, he was the guy who took his coke money to bankroll the ecstasy operation. So he'd buy like 4,000 pills. And I became ultimately certainly within 4 or 5 months, like I was the primary distributor. So he would just get the pills, give them to me, handle it. He was able to focus on his because I took care of everything else on my end. And the problem that we had was that the source of supply of ecstasy this is now we're talking 1990, just wasn't available to the degree it was later on. Like back then, it was really difficult to get product in mass. Like John could put in an order for 2,000, no problem. But if he asked for 5,000, we'd get like 3,500. You know what I mean? At this point, I got like 7 or 8 of my friends from high school. We're all selling. We're all hitting clubs every night of the week. You know, I'll be there on Wednesday night. My buddy will be there on a different club on Tuesday. Another guy's going, you know what I mean? So in the aggregate, we're needing thousands of pills a week. And we're not able to get them. I'm going to John saying, hey, we need 3,000 for this week. He puts in an order and we get 2,000. Yeah. So then he started jacking up the numbers like, okay, he'll order 6,000 and we'll get 3,000. You know, and so it became an issue where we needed to establish our own independent source of supply because ARIA simply wasn't able to come up with the material that John needed in sufficient quantity. And up until that spring of 90, it wasn't really an issue because, you know, we sold 2,000 a week. Great. Because this was his side hustle. It wasn't until that Love, Sex, Dance party where I had just gotten 3,000 pills and I saved them for the party. Well, we sold all 3,000 pills. You know, we came walking out of there and it's like, we got over 60, you know, after expenses, we got damn near $60,000. You know, and that's after we're paying the guys. It's like, and that's when John's like, oh yeah. He wanted to go all in on the ecstasy because you're making, you know, he's making 3,000 a key on the other. You know what I mean? Like take that money, let's bankroll an ecstasy operation. I told him, look, if you can get me 10,000 pills a week, I'll sell them. Yeah. Particularly now, if they're going to have raves of this size, 3,500, 4,000 people, well, you know, that's orders of magnitude greater than 800 or 900 people. Yeah. And so what he had begun doing that, you know, John was very smart, like one of the smartest people I'd ever met. He was usually the smartest guy in the room. And I think he had anticipated this problem because it turned out that he had already been having conversations with an individual who had a friend who was a retired chemistry professor from the University of Southern California. And conversations were being had. And ultimately, John was able to arrange for a meeting with him and the retired chemistry professor. And John proposed a business arrangement where initially all the chemists needed to do was develop the formula for the production of pharmaceutical grade MDMA and teach us how to do it. You know, we'll just go rent a house in Laurel Canyon up in the Hollywood Hills, turn it into a lab. Like that was the original plan. And the chemist, after back and forth negotiations, ultimately agreed. And so he ultimately came back and said, hey, look, instead of a one-time flat fee arrangement, why doesn't we set it up to where he'll start a small business that'll provide the cover to manufacture the ecstasy? So instead of going, like, you know, the thing about Les is Les wasn't a criminal. You know what I mean? He was 63, 64-year-old, like, you know, at the time I was 21. So to me, he was just an old guy. You know what I mean? He was like my grandfather's age, essentially. However, you know, older guy, retired chemist, been in academia and private, you know, the private sector for 4 decades at that point. And he wasn't a criminal. So he didn't want any red flags. Like that was his thing. Like no red flags, because there's a precursor compound. There's a precursor that you can use to manufacture ecstasy. And I have to be very careful because one of my restrictions is not talking about how to manufacture pharmaceutical grade compounds. So it's just in generalities, there's a single precursor that the DEA restricts that is one step away from ecstasy. It's a simple reduction. You're going to take 2 chemicals that are very well known and you're going to have a specific process. And from there, you're going to be able to produce the ecstasy. It's about a 4-hour reaction. Workup time, but maybe total, maybe 12 to 15 hours. He didn't want to do that because if you go on the black market to buy that, who are the people selling those chemicals? That's a way for the DEA to set people up. Right. Like if you have the chemicals, why would you sell them? Now, obviously, there are people on the black market selling them, but that's an entry point for law enforcement to be able to identify. If you're even going around asking, you know, for, you know, one of them is not a big deal, methamphetamine. Yeah. I mean, come on, man. You know, at the time, methamphetamine was going for $2,500 to $4,000 a gallon. Yeah. So you're buying 55-gallon drums. You're paying $250,000. Well, are there people selling drums? Certainly. Like, there was a mob guy out of New York operating in Orange County who was selling drums. But why would you talk to these people? Like, you don't know if he's working for the feds. Why would you, like, if you had him and you can make, why would you sell something for 250 grand that you can use to produce 20 million?
You know who the mob guy was?
Yes.
Can't say
because I don't know if he's still alive. I'll find out. If he's deceased, we'll disclose him.
Okay.
And it was interesting because his son was my friend Johnny that I was talking to. That was one of his main customers.
Oh.
You know what I mean? And so that's how we ended up getting into that particular, that's a whole other little story about this mob guy. And but anyhow, so there were people selling it. And the chemist was like, no, absolutely not. Don't ask anybody for any chemicals. Don't do anything that will attract the attention of the authorities. Because having a chemist, he simply reverse engineered the process to produce each of the precursors. So while ultimately later on, the government said, well, we were manufacturing ecstasy. No, we were manufacturing precursors and then manufacturing ecstasy. What Les did, like him and I spent probably 4 days at the chemistry library up at UCLA. And he took the principal precursor, which is listed, so I can say it, 3,4-methylenedioxybenzomethylketone, and reverse engineered the process to produce the ketone. So when we started the manufacturing process, there was nothing illegal at the lab. Everything was little. We'd have UPS delivering it, FedEx delivering it, and so the chemist said, look, we'll start a small business. Since he's a registered chemist, he'll open up accounts with various chemical companies. After we had identified the materials he needed to produce all of the restricted precursors, he just started ordering them. And so we ultimately, initially it was like proof of concept. So it was like smaller amounts. And it took us about 3 months. The lab became operational in August. We started building out the lab in July. And this was in Long Beach, right? Literally next to Long Beach Airport. Like you could go out the back door and planes are flying right overhead. And so we, John got the chemist a place to live in Long Beach. And ultimately, I was responsible for the chemist because John lived up in Beverly Hills. My friends and I lived in West Covina. However, my girlfriend lived in Newport Beach. Well, from Newport to Long Beach is, maybe 15 miles.
Right.
And so the way it'd be is like I'd swing by, I'd spend the night at my girlfriend's, drive over to Les's, pick him up in the morning, take him to the lab, run him up to UCLA, go to the chemistry library. We couldn't go to the USC library because he didn't want to see any of his old people. They'll start asking questions like, hey, what are you doing? He's got to play it off like he's retired. And he didn't want to have that kind of an association. And so we'd spend a lot of time at UCLA and he would develop the formulas. And it literally took, let's say, August, September, October. We had a phrase in our group said, back to square one. We had probably about a half a dozen manufacturers where we got nothing. Like back to square one, like it was like decision trees. Like the first step worked out. Now we got like 2 choices. So we'd have to take one. Fuck, it didn't work. Go the other route. Then go to the next route. So we literally took about, I'd say 6 or 7 manufacturers before we generated product. And when we generated that product in mid-October, it was a small amount, maybe like 1,500 doses. Again, proof of concept. And the material was absolutely amazing. Because it turned out that the overwhelming majority of the ecstasy being sold in Los Angeles wasn't actually MDMA. The MDMA compound is very difficult to synthesize. Like I can attest to that. When we actually built out our big lab, we had tens of thousands of dollars worth of laboratory equipment. We had, sophisticated instruments. We had a chemist who was in the industry for 40 years. Like we had a fully functioning lab, which was able to produce the genuine MDMA compound. The overwhelming majority of what's considered ecstasy at the time were actually what today are called analogs. They're, similar they have a similar molecular structure with somewhat similar pharmacological effects, but they're different than the MDMA itself. And so, like in the absence of knowing any better, you think what you're taking is great. But when you actually try real MDMA, it's literally an otherworldly experience. Like, I was not big on consuming. Like, for me, doing a full dose of ecstasy, like staying home with my girlfriend, like that was her thing. We'll do ecstasy together.
Right.
But the people that were in the ecstasy community, it quickly elevated us to being the most well-known traffickers, simply because we had access to the pharmaceutical. And so, like, the first couple of manufacturers were small. Like, the next one we started doing, like, we got it to the point where we were getting, we got 1 kilogram, then a 2nd kilogram, and then the third one was 2 kilograms. Like, we started scaling up a little bit, and initially we were doing 150 milligrams per dose, which came out to 6,500 doses per kilo. Now, we didn't have a pill press. And this is what became an issue later on. And this is how the FBI later on were able to infiltrate through the Beverly Hills side of the conspiracy, is because Dr. Freeman wouldn't allow us to have anything that would be suspicious at the lab. We couldn't have a pill press. We moved the lab from Long Beach. Initially, we were producing adhesives for female beauty products. Like, back in the early 90s, it was popular for African-American women to have like fake hair. Right. Like, weaved in with their hair. Like, he built his girlfriend was African-American, and her mother owned like a chain of a dozen beauty salons. Wow. And so he developed the adhesive compound that she began marketing through her beauty salons. And so, like, when the neighbors would come around, their eyes would glaze over because he's talking about, hair extensions and women's products. And nice to meet you guys. Like, they were never suspicious of what we were doing. Mm-hmm. And like, I was one of the clean cut guys, like my buddy Johnny or Joey. Like, they didn't want him around the lab because they had long hair. Like, you look at Joey, you thought he was a rock star. Whereas for me, I was clean cut, take my earrings out, put my, my Harry Potter glasses on, and I'm the lab assistant. And we had like law enforcement coming through the lab. We had the fire marshals coming through 4 times a year, quarterly inspections, semi-annual inspections, annual inspections. We had, EPA inspectors coming through because, they want to know how you're treating how are you storing your chemicals? How are you storing your waste? How are you treating your waste? Like, I'd have to demonstrate the solvent recovery systems. So this was like a fully functioning lab that no one realized was actually a cover for manufacturing ecstasy. And once we started scaling up, the original lab space was too small. Like, he'd gotten like a little, a 1,500 square foot space in a little industrial park. So we ended up moving the lab from Long Beach to the Inland Empire section of Los Angeles, which 35 years ago was, much of it was just agricultural. Right. Like, I understand today a lot of it's been built out. But when you got past Ontario Airport, it was literally, you had Chino State Prison and dairy farms. Yeah. When they built prisons, is nowhere near this town center, the city centers. That's where they built prisons. 50 years ago, 40 years ago. Well, today it's all built out. But 30 years ago, when we were operating the ecstasy labs, it was just all dairy farms. And so we ended up renting a place, probably about 6,000 square feet, which is a big lab. And we had a half a dozen workstations. And at that point, we were producing pesticides for the local agricultural community and what were characterized as micro fertilizers. So like, farmers would come in, they bring, soil samples, and they're growing this type of tomato, and the chemist would analyze the soil. You're deficient in magnesium given this crop, or you need to have custom made fertilizers with more zinc, like whatever the hell deficiencies the soil required. Well, that was our cover. And so consequently, we couldn't have a pill press at this location. Mm-hmm. And so the chemist refused to get us a pill press. And it went on to become a big issue because the product we were producing was bulk powder. And so in order to sell it at the retail level, which is what we were trying to concentrate on, because one, at that point, I was still retail, and two, I'm getting $25 a dose. And it's costing us, between John and the chemist, $5 a dose. You know what I mean? So we were splitting the money with John, but our profits were no longer $5 a dose. Our profits are now $12 a dose.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? And the arrangement we made with John is we'll work the lab, like he put up the money. And so, we started, initially it was like 6,500 doses, then a second 6,500 doses. The problem is the doses were just too potent. 150 milligrams a dose is the kind of dose that, my best friend from high school was 6'1", 215 at 21 years old. He could take a 150 milligram dose. At the time we'd be at this nightclub in LA called Vertigo's, and I'd sell 400 or 500 doses, and you get these little munchkin women, like 5'2", 100 pounds. They're like literally making out with each other, rubbing their hands all up in between each other. I mean, it got really bad. Like I was like, oh my God. Like we had to dial down the dosage because this is just, so we took it down to 120 milligrams a dose for retail distribution. We kept it at 150 for the personals. And by taking it to 120, now we're selling 8,000 doses per kilo. Mm-hmm. And so, we're generating a significant amount of money, particularly as we started scaling up. And the unfortunate turn of events was, we manufactured, like say October, November, December. Now comes early 1991. And over the course of the last 6-month period, European raves have now predominantly taken over. And the last, like the death knell for the underground hip hop warehouse party scene was a party on New Year's Eve of December 31st, 1990 called Double Hit Mickey. And that party, let me get my notes right here. That party had like 4,500 people. And we sold probably somewhere in the neighborhood of close to 4,000 doses. You understand? Like a lot of the people will buy 2 or 3 doses.
Yeah.
They're going to take one early, then they'll take one at midnight, and then they'll take a second one at 4 a.m. You know what I mean? And so, and whenever we would show up and they saw the ecstasy powder had a light tan coloration. So if you look at like Lipton iced tea, not the little pouches, like the regular iced tea, the powder, that's the kind of color. It's like that tannish color. And so when we started showing up, and when people saw the brown capsules, they'd go nuts. They'd just start stockpiling.
So y'all made about $100,000
one night.
Jesus Christ!
Yeah, and we're talking $1990.
Yeah,
it was like $230,000 today. You got, we're 21 years old. We just made a fucking 100 G's. And one, you know what I mean? It's like next thing you know, like I moved to Beverly. We just start moving to Beverly Hills. Like fuck it. Yeah. Why am I going to stay in West Covina? You know what I mean? Like up until that first year and a half, I was driving a little like Toyota mini truck. I had the scooter truck I had from high school. I got my first BMW. Like I went 3 Series. 6 months later, I went up to a 5 Series. A year later, I'm up to a 7. So I just kept, everything just kept upgrading essentially. And so the Double Hit Mickey really changed the rave culture because it puts at bed the underground hip hop scene, and it established Los Angeles as the rave capital of the United States. Like the parties in New York may have been more authentic raving experiences, and the parties in San Francisco were considered more authentic. Like San Francisco had a huge rave culture, but you have to understand, Los Angeles is 10 times bigger than San Francisco.
Right.
You know what I mean? So San Francisco back in 1990 was not a big city. It had like 700,000 people. We had suburbs in LA bigger than San Francisco. There were suburbs in LA bigger than Miami, bigger than Las Vegas. It's an enormous city. Yeah. And so, but the authentic experiences were in those particular venues. Los Angeles became the undisputed king, however, for the raves because the parties were so over the top. And oftentimes, because they were being thrown in venues where they were rented, you didn't have to worry about the police breaking it up. The police are outside making sure there's no problems. Like we had to smuggle the product in because they're searching for product. And like I said, that was the death knell for what I consider to be the cool parties. Right. From this part forward, you had this music, the parties with the horrible music, but just enormous, overwhelming inputs, like sensory inputs. The lighting shows were amazing. They were themed. You know what I mean? You had like Dr. Seuss characters running around everywhere. You had, Alice in Wonderland characters running around everywhere. You'd have like, like a young woman, 21-year-old chick, blonde hair in a blue dress, dressed like Alice, getting chased by a half a dozen car, like Queen of Hearts and her minions. People are just Xing out of their fucking minds, and you've got characters everywhere. Like, yeah, little railroad tracks coming through. It's just like these extraordinary parties that, for the next year, like year and a half, really captured Los Angeles. You had a huge run up until the riots. So here we are in early 91, the riots until the spring of 92. That changed everything, of course.
You're referring to the Watts riots?
The LA riots.
LA riot, okay.
Yeah, after Rodney King.
Yeah.
Yeah. After after the cops were acquitted in April of 92, you had enormous riots in Los Angeles. And that really changed the rave scene, but we're not necessarily there yet. From our perspective, when things flipped over to the raves in early 91, there was a misfortunate event in that the chemical that we were using that was 100% legal, which I'm not going to say, was restricted, not because it was put on the DEA's list of restricted chemicals, but because the FDA restricted it. You have to understand, in the pharmaceutical industry in the United States, and this is what I learned from the chemist, Les explained to me that the pharmaceutical industry in the United States they cannot patent a natural compound. You can't patent vitamin C.
Right.
Hence, pharmaceutical companies don't get involved in vitamins. Now, they can create their own vitamins with a separate molecular structure, and they can patent that. You understand what I'm saying? And so it's like you can't patent opium derived from poppy plants. But you can, of course, create morphine or then later on heroin. These are derivatives of opium. Well, you can't patent that. But what you can patent is synthetic opioids, like Phenny. Phenny was created in a lab. It's not derived from the poppy plant. You see what I'm saying? And so the pharmaceutical industry has a long tradition of identifying compounds that are natural and then having them restricted. Like they'll gin up some pretext. It's a carcinogen. Like the same companies selling cigarettes that kill 200,000 people a year are now concerned about a carcinogen, something with a very modest carcinogenic effect. Like anything can be particularly carcinogenic. But they utilize that as the pretext to take this essential oil off the market. So now if you wanted to buy it, you had to buy the synthetic version.
I got you.
Well, we didn't know that this was going to take effect in January of 91, on January 1st. So we hadn't stockpiled. Like at the time of this event happening, we had like maybe 2 gallons set aside. Like, we would buy it in gallon increments. We had like maybe 2 gallons set aside. And so I immediately started scrambling. So like I went to the essential oil shop in Hollywood and I bought like the last 2 gallons they had. And I started literally like over the next 3 months, I went to every natural herb and essential oil shop in Southern California. I'm talking from Van Nuys to San Diego. And too many of them were too prompt in taking them out of the stock. Oh no, we can order you this new one. Like I don't want the new one. I can but you got to play it off. Like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll come back. Like, what you can't tell them I need it because I'm making product.
Right.
And so we had essentially like a 5 kilo manufacturer. At that point, we got the yield up to 2.5 keys. Like we were never able to get it past 2.5 keys per gallon. We were supposed to be getting 5 keys per gallon, but we weren't. The lab, although it was, very sophisticated. And keep in mind, in 1990 and 1991, according to the U.S. Department of Justice statistics, there were 2 labs in the United States that were apprehended. Like ecstasy was not
on the radar. Yeah,
it was not on their radar. Put it this way: dealing ecstasy, there was 0 prosecutions by the LA District Attorney's Office, and the penalties for dealing ecstasy were the same as the penalties for dealing nitrous oxide, which was essentially nothing. Even at the federal level, like when I ultimately got prosecuted, I was primarily an ecstasy dealer who ended up getting in trouble for extracurricular activity.
Right.
And I'm not trying to diminish the extracurricular activity. Okay, it was significant, but that's not how I was known within the trafficking community. Yeah. Like I was the ecstasy guy getting involved on the side with this. You say, and the government didn't even charge me for the ecstasy because essentially at that point, like I had like a statutory maximum of 5 years.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so like they didn't, you know what I mean? And so it was like, it wasn't until later on, like I think the ecstasy guidelines really were jacked up like 98, 99, 2000. Mm-hmm. You know, ecstasy crossed over from being a club drug to something of general consumption in about 1996.
Okay.
You know, so we're talking about events back in 1990 still, 91, early 91. And so, you know, we had, and so because the labs were, although expensive, they didn't design for producing pharmaceutical compounds. Like we didn't have the ability to control climate. You know what I mean? We weren't able to control humidity. Like there were factors that would ultimately impact the yield that resulted in us only getting about a 50% yield. So we topped off at about 2.5, 2.6, maybe 2.7 keys per gallon. And I got like, we had 2 gallons at the time of the ban. I found 2 more gallons in Hollywood. Like I found another gallon in February. Then we went 3 months, no product. Now keep in mind at this point, John would continue getting product from Aria. Like we didn't turn that spigot off. It's just now it's like when we had our product, I focused on selling that and the product John got from Aria. But when we had like a 3-month lacuna where there was no product available, again, we flipped over to, you know, the ecstasy pills at the time that were popular were called UFOs. Generally, they would be called flying saucers. You know, the ecstasy community early on had adopted the alien motif. Like the character that represented the ecstasy community was Marvin the Martian.
Okay.
You know, the little Warner brother, the Bugs Bunny buddy.
Yeah.
All right. So like if you're walking through a mall and you see some hot chick wearing a Marvin the Martian shirt, you know she did ecstasy. Like that's how they signaled to one another. You know, like Dr. Seuss was popular, Felix the Cat was popular, but Marvin the Martian was the most popular because the ecstasy pills, they were actually fairly large size pills. They weren't like little aspirins. They were a little bit larger and they were shaped like little flying saucers. Hence, they were called flying saucers and hence the adoption of Marvin the Martian. And so for a few months there, we were just back to selling saucers. And in May, I found another gallon. This was at a place in San Diego. Like just stumbled upon, like it was like a lucky stroke. And 3 weeks later, right before Memorial Day weekend, me and a couple of my buddies run our way out to Lake Havasu, and I'm pulling the boat, you know, and my pager starts going off. One of the people from the Hollywood shop called and said, "Hey, we just cleaned out our inventory. We found 3 more gallons. Are you still interested before we discard them?" Like, are you fucking kidding me? You know, I'm pulling a fucking boat. Like, fuck this. I'm getting off the fucking freeway. You know, unfortunately, I was able to find my roommate, my buddy. I said, "Hey, Robert, get up to this." He'd been with me on many times on my excursions. You know, he was one of the core distributors. So I told Robert, "Hey, go get this." So boom, he goes up. Like that weekend was spectacular because we knew we were coming home to 3 gallons.
Right.
You know, that week, you know, that was probably the best weekend of my life, I would say. You know, up in Lake Havasu, you know, we had the biggest boat on the water. We probably had 15 women, at least 8 or 9 of them were Playboy models. Had a couple of porn stars. Like the first weekend I spent having a 3-day bender, fooling around with an adult film actress. You know what I mean? It was like, so for a 22-year-old, like that's the weekend I made it.
Oh yeah. That's good times.
You know what I mean? Like that's when, like, okay, you know, because growing up, like I went from being the computer geek who played piano to that, you know, and that was a transition that no one really expected. And so when we got back home, we knocked out that load. And see, you know, although John was the leader of the ecstasy group, his supplier was Aria. John and Aria were good friends. Mm-hmm. And the arrangement we had with John was that we would manufacture. John puts up the money. We operate the lab. Like he put up the capital. We worked at the lab. Right. And of course, John would come to the lab and he learned the processes along with us, but none of the Beverly Hills guys could come. Like the chemist only wanted me and my friends because, I was formerly an honor student, top 2% in the nation, top 2% in the state of California, top 5% in the nation. Scored a 95th percentile on my college entrance exams. I got full scholarship. I jacked it off to go be a drug dealer, so I'm an idiot. But, the bright kid with the scientific mindset. And so between me and my best friend, he was like, man, these guys are great. You guys worked a lab. So Sean and I handled the lab essentially, while, the other guys in my circle handled the distribution. Well, when we would manufacture the product, the arrangement was 50-50 split. So West Covina would get half of the load to manufacture. Beverly Hills would get the other half. Well, John would just turn around, give it to his buddy Aria, and Aria would handle distribution. So there was always a little bit of tension between the two groups because they were always like crying in John's ear, it's not fair. Why are they getting half? You put up all the money. Like, hey, jackass, we work at the fucking lab.
Right.
If LAPD comes through the door, you guys aren't going to jail. We are.
Yeah.
And so there was that issue where, half of the product was going to Beverly Hills. Whereas, so if there's a 40,000 dose manufacturer would be 5 keys. They'd get 20,000, we get 20,000. And by that spring of 91, I had gotten moved up to wholesale distribution activity. So I'd gotten my first wholesale customer, who was a guy down in Orange County. Then, like that spring, through one of the strippers, I got introduced to a guy that she was dating. He was a cocaine trafficker from Chicago coming to LA to get product at LA prices. He tried ecstasy with her for the first time, fell in love with ecstasy. Next thing you know, we start to, slowly, but we end up building a significant trafficking relationship. So there was at this point, I was in the process of developing relationship with 2 guys that would later on become 2 of my main guys.
Right.
So I was transitioning away from the retail scene. 1, because I couldn't stand the music. At this point, it was just all raves. And 2, I was deeply involved with the manufacturing, and I was now developing the capacity to sell, 10,000 doses at a time rather than 1,000 doses at 3 nightclubs over the course of 3 nights.
Right.
So I was making less money, but I saw where it was going because once we were able to obtain a secure source of the chemicals, the sky was the limit. So my concern was build out the wholesale capacity. And that summer, after we made that manufacture, we ended up producing, it's let's say 40 to 60,000 doses. But Aria and one of his friends, his buddy Rob, spent that summer backpacking in Europe. Like these rich kids would go on these stupid trips, you know what I mean? And so we ended up getting all the product for West Covina. And so that allowed me essentially, because I was the principal distributor, to build out our distribution capacity. And now during that 3-month period where we weren't able to manufacture ecstasy because we didn't have access to the chemicals, we had this lab that wasn't being used. Well, my buddy John, of course, never one to squander an opportunity. John was a Harley Davidson aficionado, and he had probably one of the nicest bikes in LA. He lived up in Beverly Hills. He rode. There was an early 1990s wave of Harley enthusiasm, and it was very prominent within the entertainment industry. The Jay Lenos, the Arnold Schwarzeneggers, the Tom Cruises, like those, the biggies at the time.
Yeah.
And on Sundays, they would all gather at a restaurant in Malibu called Gladstone's. And this is how John started really networking with the entertainment industry. So later on, he just played off like he was involved with producing. He just knew the guys because they all rode Harleys.
Yeah.
But he knew them. You know what I mean? He knew the guys from Poison. Rock stars would leave nightclubs to go outside and check out his Harley because he'd park it right in front. And the thing about it, what was interesting is that the shop that built the high-end Harley Davidsons for movie stars, rock stars, and big money dope dealers was located way out in San Bernardino, which is, nowhere near Beverly Hills. And the shop was owned by an individual that was a member of the San Bernardino chapter of the Hells Angels. The Hells Angel guys are just obviously they're all Harley Davidson fanatics, of course. Right. I mean, I'm not a motorcycle guy. I don't particularly care for motorcycles. I appreciate a nice piece of machinery. Right. John's motorcycle was beautiful, but I wouldn't ride that thing in a million years. You know what I mean? And so he built his first bike, which, maybe $30,000, which was a lot of money in 1990.
Yeah.
91, he built a second bike. And this was his show bike. And the thing about John is, again, rich kid who he'll drop 50 to 60 grand into a bike and then ride it every day. Like he wasn't one of these guys that built it and didn't ride it.
Yeah.
He'd be screaming down Sunset Boulevard. You could hear that thing, 2 blocks away. It was so fucking loud, but he actually rode the bike, and the Hells Angel guys loved him. Like it was shocking because he was like kind of like a pretty boy. Like he was a good looking guy, but like, little spiky hair, earring, he's like, like the whole West LA, Beverly Hills scene.
Right.
But he knew more about motorcycles than any Hells Angel. Like he could literally talk. You ask him what kind of, what engine size did they have in the 1952 fucking Shovelhead or whatever the hell they called them. He'd tell you. Like he could literally break down everything. These guys just fell in love with him. And of course, he's coming out there and he's dropping big money on these bikes. And like he was like a traveling billboard. People would see his bike, like, hey, who built that? Yeah, he'd give out cards. Hey, call my guy. This is John, the superficial posturing. Call my guy. Call my guy. He probably got 20 bikes sold for these guys. They're all costing 30, 40, 50 grand. Again, at that time period, it was big money for a Harley. Yeah. And I had one drug trafficking buddy who bought 2 Harleys. He spent like 100 grand on 2 bikes at that shop. I know another guy that spent about 40, 50 grand. So like he's bringing the big money clientele to these guys. So he ends up developing a rapport with several of the guys from the Hells Angels in San Bernardino chapter, which is considered like the mother chapter, is like the first one,
right,
for their entire operation, essentially. And like the shop wasn't associated with the club. Like the shop was owned by a member of the club. Like they were careful to kind of keep it
separate the two.
Separated. That way it wasn't subject to getting caught up in a RICO or anything.
Right.
But everybody knew it was a Hells Angel shop. And, and like when John would get his bikes built, like he didn't spare any expense. You could take his whole bike apart with like an Allen wrench. Like everything was custom. He brought in the best guy in Southern California for motors was a Hells Angel from Orange County. Bring him in to build that motor. The best frame guy, some guy out of Ventura, bring him in. Like, top expenses. They ended up like putting John's bike in a number of competitions. Like he won regional shows. And because it was Hells Angels who built the motorcycle for him, he let them paint his bike red and white, which is their colors. And they would enter in all kinds of competitions. So like John was like on the speed dial for several of these guys.
Yeah.
And so long story short, we've got this lab that's not being used for anything.
I can see where this is going.
Right? So John, of course, knows several Hells Angels. And at the time, the Hells Angels were involved in trafficking methamphetamine.
Oh, yeah.
And like they had the lock, essentially. This was before the Mexicans had really even got involved domestically here in the United States.
Right.
And, they were just starting to like poke around the edges, but nothing of any significance. And, well, the individual who I was engaged in trafficking ecstasy with, who would sell me my Beamers, his sister was dating one of the main Hells Angels. And so John ends up talking to the guy that I know who hooks up through his sister with the Hells Angel guy in San Bernardino, who they expressed an interest in buying, pounds of methamphetamine, essentially. John's not directly dealing with the Hells Angels, but the guys there know him. So they're willing to do business. They won't talk to him directly. They let the guys, the members whose girlfriend is brother, like, they'll go through family members. Why expose yourself if you've got a guy who's got an old lady whose brother knows the guy? Like, she's not going to set up her brother. The brother's not going to set up her.
Right.
Let the brother take the risk. Of course, John has to posture and let everybody know, yeah, he's dealing with the red and white. Another investigation that we get brought up under. He never dealt with the Hells Angel guy. He dealt with the guy in Orange County. But so sure enough, he goes to Dr. Friedman, me and Les, we get back up to the chemistry library at UCLA, spend a couple of days, and develop the formula for the production of pharmaceutical grade methamphetamine. So now not only did we have the capacity to produce pharmaceutical grade MDMA, now we're producing pharmaceutical grade methamphetamine out of non-regulated chemicals. Everything is getting delivered to the shop That was the code phrase for the lab. Everything was being delivered to the lab, UPS, or we just go and pick it up ourselves. And same process. There's two ways essentially to manufacture methamphetamine. Well, there's a number of ways, but the two principal ways are either through ephedrine or through phenyl 2-propanone. Common knowledge. I'm not divulging anything.
Right.
Both of these are, of course, restricted. And for many years, the Mexicans were using the ephedrine, pseudoephedrine route. In order for us to get that, you'd have to go on the black market. Dr. Friedman wasn't having any red flags. So same thing. We went and developed the formula for the production of the P2P, the phenyl 2-propanone, out of non-regulated chemicals. So we start, knocking out loads of the material. And what was interesting, like on the first time, the Hells Angels actually wanted to reject the product. Like the guy that we knew came back. He's like, hey, we got a problem. They're like, they're not taking this. They think it's cut. Like it was so white. It was like pearly, like pearl white, like mother of pearl sheen. It was like blinding white with like a mother of pearl coating. It was like polished. Like they'd never seen anything that pure. And, and that's one of the lessons I learned from the chemist is in the drug game, the overwhelming majority of individuals have no understanding of chemistry.
Right.
And so what they bring to the table are their expectations. Like at the time, the popular variant of that particular material that we've been discussing was called peanut butter meth. Mm-hmm. And it was called peanut butter because it had the dark brownish coloration. Well, that dark brown, that's all harmful impurities. You know what I mean? That's all unreacted material or harmful impurities.
Right.
So from a business perspective, that translates into weight. And from a consuming perspective, you're ingesting, like I said, harmful impurities. And the thing about the chemist is Dr. Friedman, he made sure that we were always producing pharmaceutical grade material because for him, like I said, he wasn't a criminal. He knew that people were going to be ingest this. So he had a moral obligation to make sure it wouldn't harm any of the people that were taking it. Like we never harmed the environment. We had to treat all the waste, store the waste properly, dispose of everything properly. Dr. Friedman was it was a very different lab experience than what I would hear about later on when I was in prison. Like nobody had quality control measures in place. Like for us, everything had to be able to pass his standard essentially.
Right.
And so this goes on on that initial one, it was actually funny. The first load, they reject the product. So my brother, the guy brings it back like, okay. So we explain the situation to the chemist. So we saturate the material again in solution. Les and I go to the grocery store. We buy a whole little things of food coloring, like the different colors, like pink, red, yellow, green, blue. We got one. We got the one with the brown, dropped in some food coloring, and turned it. So in order to get it to be like the color of peanut butter.
Yeah.
And so we had to literally adulterate it by adding food color because these guys who don't know anything about fucking chemistry have the nerve to claim the product is cut. Like later on in my case, one of the guys that was recorded by the FBI talking about the product I produced, he's like, I don't know. I think he's cutting his product. Like every one of my seizures, like 100% pure, 100% pure, 100% pure, 100% pure. Like, hey, Jack, you got the best quality product on the market, but you don't have a frame of reference with which to evaluate it.
Yeah.
And so people who don't know anything can't tell the difference.
Mm-hmm.
That's why when people actually started taking the pharmaceutical grade MDMA, they realized there's an entirely different level of experience than what we had normally been taking. Because for the first year, I thought the ecstasy that we were getting from Aria was great, but it wasn't genuinely MDMA.
Right.
And so that's what happened with the whole Hells Angel thing. And this went on for a few months. Then we got the ecstasy precursor back. So we knocked out a couple loads. So essentially the lab's got dual purposes now.
Right.
Right. And we were looking for the precursor that the FDA had restricted. Well, the guy that was the middleman between the Hells Angels, he was able to talk to the Hells Angel guys. They found us 255-gallon drums. Now we're getting at that point 2.5 kilos per gallon. So you're talking about 20,000 doses per gallon. 255-gallon drums is going to make us about 2 million doses. You're talking about $25 million. And so he comes back. He's like, hey, Hell's Angels found us 255-gallon drums. Okay, what do they want for it? They want 110,000. They wanted 1,000 a gallon. Like they had no idea what they were sitting on.
Yeah. Bought it. Buy it. Buy
it. But here's the interesting thing. They wanted $110,000 for 255-gallon drums, but they didn't want the payment in cash. They wanted the payment in product, but not our product, the ecstasy. They wanted their product. And they didn't want the methamphetamine being produced through the non-restricted manner. They had gotten their hands on some 55-pound canisters of ephedrine. So they're like, hey, they wanted to shoot us their chemicals. Well, we knew that they weren't cops.
Yeah.
You know, and again, John's not dealing with the Hells Angels. He's dealing with the guy that's the middleman.
Mm-hmm.
And so so we essentially had to agree to manufacture their ephedrine into their material as payment for the material that for the 255-gallon drums that we needed for the ecstasy. And see, and this is ultimately what happened. Like, here's a circumstance where I got involved in seriously, like in, let's say, the methamphetamine context.
Right.
To further the ecstasy operation.
Right.
Later on, when I got involved with the cocaine, it was to further the ecstasy operation. I was getting the product from Vancouver. I had to deal with the Chinese. Remember, we had that episode where we talked about the Chinese money laundering. Well, this is how the Chinese come into the picture. It's got nothing to do with the Chinese.
Yeah.
It's just that the product was coming out of Vancouver. They were Chinese. So now we had to develop that connection. You know what I mean? So everything, the substrate that formed the basis upon which all the subsequent drug activity was based upon was always the ecstasy. And so in order for us to produce that material for them, me and the chemist had to go back up to the chemistry library, UCLA. We spent a couple of days, developed the formula. And this is how we learned how. So now we learned how to produce, meth essentially from two different starting points.
Yeah.
And again, like we're getting 90+% yields with 100%, purity levels. And ultimately later on, that's how the authorities would knock us off, essentially.
They knew that was your stuff.
That was the DEA agent said that was the signature. Every time there was seizures, either out of LA, San Francisco, Seattle, like anything on the West Coast, Honolulu, where the product was 100% pure, it always led back to Beverly Hills. And she said that was your guys' signature because there just wasn't that many people. Today, it's not all that unusual because you've got, the operations in Mexico are, from a manufacturing perspective, they're extraordinary because they're sophisticated and they're using real chemists. It's not like, not like the Hells Angels in the 80s with some bathtub loads. You know what I mean? It was like, these are serious people producing serious product. Well, 30 years ago, there weren't too many American operations like that.
Right.
Simply because not too many guys are going to have their hands on an actual chemist.
Right.
And so we started knocking out the loads. It took us like 3 manufacturers to produce their product for the Hells Angels. They gave us the 255-gallon drums. And that's when, by this point now, we're talking like September of 91. And, within the rave side, I had not only began to dislike the raves because of the crappy music, but they had started going commercial. Like at least with the underground clubs when we started a couple years earlier, like everything was illegal. Like there was that excitement, that edge of, like you're not going to get in trouble for going to an underground club, but you're going into a shitty part of town. Everything was just, it had a certain allure to it, like that outlaw image. Whereas now they're having raves like at Knott's Berry Farm. It's like an amusement park. It's like a big rave in Knott's. You know what I mean? It's like they had one called Gilligan's Island on Santa Catalina Island. Like daytime raves at amusement parks, raves at the Shrine Auditorium. Like you could rent the Shrine. Like the American Dental Association rents the Shrine Auditorium for a convention. You know what I mean? Like there's nothing, edgy about this. This is just, kind of lame. You know what I mean? Like I'm not one to denigrate, but like this just wasn't my crowd. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It was like, now, of course, it was enormous as ecstasy markets. And so like one of the guys in my circle, my buddy Danny, had developed relationships with several of the promoters. So we went from supplying the retail sides to supplying the promoters. They're going to throw a 5,000 person rave. We'll just sell them the 5,000 doses. Let them handle distribution, because now we're making a lot more product. We're not worried about, well, we only got 20,000 out of this shipment. We got to divvy it up. Now it's like, okay, well, how many you need? We're essentially sitting on, 70, 80, 90,000 dose manufacturers.
Right.
I was able to take it to the point where I'm selling 10,000 doses to this guy and 10,000 doses to this guy, 20,000 doses to this guy. You know what I mean? So the manufacturing had scaled up, corresponding wholesale distribution activity had scaled up. And with the raves having become essentially Disneylands, it provided the pretext I needed to kind of disengage from that culture. Mm-hmm. We kept supplying some of the people that were involved with throwing the raves, but other than that, I wanted to become like the largest ecstasy dealer on the West Coast. You know what I mean? That was like my ambition at that point as a 22-year-old. And
is that how you would eventually wind up meeting the what's his name, Jimmy?
No, well, okay, well, Jimmy, you have to understand, that's a funny story. Remember, I had told you about how my buddy John loved the posture. And I keep at this point, that June, we moved to a house up in Beverly Hills, about 6,500 square feet. In 1991, the economy was in a major recession.
Right.
And so, we were living pretty large. I just got my 5 Series Beamer, moved up to like a 7,000 square foot house. And the girlfriend that I knew from high school and I had broken up because I was now interested in women I didn't know growing up. You know what I mean? And so it was a big turn in my life. And at that point, we basically were associating mainly with Playboy models, a handful of adult film actresses, or and the rest were just bombshell strippers. Mm-hmm. And I had my good girlfriend who lived down in Orange County. But with me living up in Beverly Hills, I had the freedom to be engaging in, I didn't respect the relationship. Let's just put it that way.
Right.
And several of there was the largest American, let's say, cocaine trafficker in Los Angeles was an individual named Jimmy Prentice. And Jimmy was a legendary trafficker in the sense that, you've got that cartel level operations. Mm-hmm. But the cartel guys, the actual cartel guys, they don't talk to Americans. If you're white or black, you will never speak to a cartel level operative. You may speak to a Mexican national, but he ain't cartel. He's disposable. Because from their perspective, their point of risk is dealing with gringos.
Right.
So for you to even be talking to one of these individuals, you have to, at a minimum, be Latino and having been vouched for. Mm-hmm. Now, Jimmy was extraordinary in the sense that he was a very large cocaine trafficker. He didn't actually deal with cartel guys, but the cartel operatives supplied their Mexican-American cutout who dealt with him. So he was about as close as a gringo could get to cartel level operations. And he, Jimmy, at the time, he owned probably 40 homes in the Valley. He's picking up 700, 800, 900 kilo loads, $15 to $20 million at a time. I mean, a serious trafficker. And Jimmy, of course, was made famous because he was the guy who, in the late 80s, there was a very popular band in Los Angeles called Motley Crue.
Oh, yeah.
And the lead singer for Motley Crue was an individual named Vince Neil. And Vince Neil had married a woman, pretty sure she was like her and her sister were like Playboy models, like they were twins, I believe. Right. And they worked up at the Hollywood Tropicana. Like a lot of them Playboy girls worked at Tropicana, famous club in LA. Mm-hmm. And his Vince Neil's wife, Charisse, had been unfaithful in the relationship. And turns out the guy that she had been fooling around with is Jimmy. And so when Vince Neil and the band found out about Jimmy's having been nailing the lead singer's wife, they wrote a song basically disclosing Jimmy's trafficking activities to the world. And their most famous album was called Dr. Feelgood. And the title track off that album is the single Dr. Feelgood. And that single is about Jimmy.
So When you told me that story, that blew my mind, because as many times as I've heard that song, it's just one of them things that you just sing, but you never really stop and listen to the lyrics.
Yeah, well, like it's like secondhand hood named Jimmy, lives in Hollywood, deals in powder goods. Like
I'm actually fixing to read this. Right, I want to read.
Yeah,
this
whatever.
to kind of give some context here.
Okay.
So it starts off. Rat Tail Jimmy is a secondhand hood, deals out in Hollywood. Got a 65 Chevy, primer with flames, traded for some powder goods. Did he really have a 65 Chevy?
I never saw him in a 65 Chevy.
Jigsaw Jimmy, he's the one in the game, but I hear he's doing okay. Got a cozy little job selling for the Mexican mob, packages the candy cane.
Yeah.
All right, that's not it.
Yeah. And so, there was a period there, like Jimmy was busted in the spring of 92. And so like, this is during our ascension.
Right.
At this point, I went from being a 22-year-old who was, fairly well known within the rave community to, the big money traffickers. The guys in their 30s and 40s knew me because a lot of those guys dated these women.
Mm-hmm.
The women in that particular circle, like, the Playboy model types, they don't date broke guys.
Right.
They're dating movie stars, rock stars, and drug dealers. And there's lot more drug dealers in LA than there's anything else, than celebrities. And many of the guys that I ultimately developed ecstasy trafficking relationships with were guys who were dating some of the girls. Mm-hmm. Like, if I'm sleeping with a girl and I know her roommate and I know her best friend, and I meet the guys that they're dating, or my best friend's dating a Playboy model, and I meet, her 3 friends are dating 3 other drug dealers. And so essentially, like, how I used to only approach women at the retail level to filter out cops, later on when I built my nationwide ecstasy distribution network, it was essentially through meeting drug traffickers from other parts of the country that came to LA that kept their LA honey on the side. Mm-hmm. Like my guy in Chicago kept his LA mistress in LA. The guy from Miami had his side piece in LA. All these guys had their side pieces in LA. Most of them were, those kind of women essentially.
Right.
And Jimmy's girlfriend worked at the Hollywood Tropicana. So he was nailing a girl from the Tropicana. He had been previously with another girl from the Tropicana, the one who was Vince Neil's wife. And so during that run up to like the latter half of 92, I achieved a level of renown throughout the higher level trafficking community that someone at that particular age group normally would have never had, because all of those guys wanted the pharmaceutical. Mm-hmm. And you could only get the pharmaceutical through one group. At the time, the primary distributors of ecstasy in LA were the Israelis, and they were bringing in, large quantities of product from Europe, but they couldn't get the pharmaceuticals. Mm-hmm. So, and I would always joke around because I knew several of those guys. Like, I feel like you guys are selling like the Toyota Camrys of the ecstasy world. You're like Budweiser guys. Like, you're not in our market. Like, I'm dealing to Ferraris. Like, you leave that strata to me. You know what I mean? And so the guys that later on I ultimately got involved in other trafficking contexts with, I actually met through many of the girls because they wanted to get ecstasy for themselves. And then after you develop a rapport with them, now you can step to them. Hey, look, can I get, or do you need some of the other? And they're already, my first coke transaction with Juan was my 15th deal with him.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so with respect to the whole Jimmy thing, one of the guys I also got involved in dealing with, went on to become a famous porn star. He was dealing with Jimmy. And so like you had my buddy, who later on was my roommate, dealing with Jimmy. At the time Jimmy got busted, my roommate had been dealing with Jimmy. Meanwhile, my buddy John was cheating on his girlfriend. He was in a relationship with a woman named Jenny, but he was cheating on her with a Playboy model named Susie. Susie was good friends with Jimmy's girl. And again, as I indicated earlier, John was one of those guys who postured like he wasn't dealing with the Hells Angels. He was dealing with Chuck. Chuck dealt with the Hells Angels.
Right.
But John let everybody know, he's in with the red and white. John wasn't dealing with Lucho. John was dealing with the Mexican-American cutout that they didn't care if he got busted or not. Mm-hmm. But as far as everybody was concerned, John was dealing with Lucho, big cartel guy in LA. Same thing with Jimmy. John wasn't dealing with Jimmy. John's side piece was friends with Jimmy's girlfriend. Right. And so Jimmy would, that would get John invited to the parties. It wasn't John getting invited. It was Susie getting invited, and she'd take John.
Yeah, he was tagging along.
You know what I mean? But, and what was funny is, and that's actually how the FBI got ran up on us, because unfortunately he had begun interacting with the confidential informant, whose quote unquote business partner was actually a cross-designated federal agent assigned to the FBI's drug task force. They were both operating in undercover capacity, posing as large-scale cocaine traffickers from San Francisco. And they were like loosely associated, like the biker scene. They were like on the fringes of some Hell's Angel guys and like the rocker scene.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And so here you had John was quote unquote friends with Jimmy. He'd tell everybody, yeah, me and Jimmy are like this. Like, come on, man. Like, you know what I mean? Like I know it's all bullshit, but other people, of course, don't. But when he told that to an FBI agent,
and
his informant, it painted a huge bullseye on us. Now we're living in a 6,000 square foot house in Beverly Hills. The oldest guy in our group at this point, John, was 27. He's dealing directly with Jimmy. Boom, they started mass, that kicked off the investigation that ultimately resulted in, 6 years later.
Yeah. The guy you were living with, that was, can we say his name?
Well, later, at this point when Jimmy's going on with John, it was John Ellenberger.
Right.
And I was dealing ecstasy with my friend Jay.
Mm-hmm.
His name is, he was the famous porn star what was his name? You said?
Jay Gardenia? Or
yeah,
Justin Sterling was his name on film. And the only reason, I don't tend to know a lot of male porn stars' names, but the only reason why I know him is because of his very famous, probably one of the most famous porn stars, at least in my opinion, Jenna Jameson. He was married to her, and they done a lot of actual on-screen films together.
Yeah. When he and I stopped doing business together was about 3 years before I got indicted. Like, he and I were good friends, but he had gotten involved with porn. Like, at the time, he was dating Chasey Lane.
Yeah.
Who was, one of the most beautiful porn stars.
Yeah.
She wasn't your quintessential, California blonde. She was just spectacular in person. Right. And so he called me up actually one afternoon. He's like, hey, man, I'm going full into porn. You want to go? And I'm like, no, man. And honestly, I knew a bunch of actresses, but I'd seen maybe 2 films, with one film with one girlfriend, one film with another. I wasn't into porn at all. I didn't care for strip clubs. I knew strippers. I didn't go to clubs. I knew porn stars. I didn't watch movies. Yeah. You know what I mean? I didn't need the fantasy. I knew the people.
You kind of had the behind the scenes to it anyway. The real.
Yeah. And so, at the time, so Jay's in with Jimmy while my roommate is posturing like he's in with Jimmy. And Jay was there on the night that Jimmy and Vince Neil came to blows over Charisse. And it was so bad, that last 6 months before Jimmy got knocked off, he had his own theme music. It was like Darth Vader. He'd walk into a nightclub and Dr. Feelgood would come on. You know what I mean? It was you knew when he was in the house. You could be at a regular nightclub. Where you were up at Bar One. We're all partying in Beverly Hills. We're on the Sunset Strip at the Roxbury, or just real exclusive nightclubs, and they'll stop the hip hop song or the dance song to put on Dr. Feelgood when Jimmy walked in the house. And it was in the fort. And when he ended up getting knocked off, about 2 months before he got arrested, I was dealing with Jay, and at that point I was sitting on probably a couple 100,000 ecstasy doses. So, I'm 23 years old, $2.5 million worth of product. Mm-hmm. And so we were significant ecstasy operators. Later on, 200,000 doses would be considered an average deal for the Israelis.
Right.
Well, I got to become friends in prison with a guy named Tamer Ibrahim. And Tamer and I didn't really know each other on the street, but we were both in Beverly Hills. He dealt with my friends. Right. We were on the other side of the same conspiracy. But he went on to become the biggest ecstasy dealer in the history of the country. Okay. And for him, 200,000 doses was an average size. But 6 years before he got rocking and rolling, back in 92, 200,000 was, there weren't anybody operating at that level, essentially. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I was already being targeted by the DEA out of Orange County because my at this point, my friend from high school's older brother had become my best friend. And Joey had done a deal with the mob guy's son down in Orange County, the guy who had the chemicals. And jumping on the 405 freeway, you had a 2-person carpool lane. So I jumped in the car with my buddy to ride down to OC. He did the deal in the parking lot, but I was there. And so he sold the product to the mob guy's son. The mob guy's son gives the product to his partner. The partner goes and puts the product into the hands of a DEA agent. And so when it came time, he flipped, but he protected the mob guy's son. So he said, hey, look, I got it from Joey, but he didn't know my best friend's last name. But he knew me because earlier that summer, when I was during that single period, I had been sleeping with a girl who turns out he had a crush on. So he knew who I was. So the name he gave to the DEA was mine and my best friend's, even though it was Joey's deal, but I was present. You know what I mean? No, so technically that would make me a part of the conspiracy. I'm not trying to disavow any culpability, right. But the fact of the matter is I got lit up because I had jumped on the car to help my buddy, hit the carpool lane.
Yeah.
And
recognize you because of a girl you were seeing.
And this guy, unfortunately, recognizing me because he had a crush on the same girl from 4 or 5 months earlier.
We've just talked. I just want to mention this really cool. We've talked for almost like an hour and a half, and you've told me the level of sophistication that you guys are working with. You got chemists, you got the best products, you got the best chemicals. You're doing all this stuff to get the highest grade, the highest purity, and that's what brings you down.
Yeah, and that's still 6 years away.
Yeah.
Well, see, and that's why the individuals, a very famous producer had snapped up the rights to my story in 22. Mm-hmm. And they ultimately passed on doing the story because it's just too long.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying? It's like there's too many, if you really can't tell the story in a 2-hour film. Which is why they're developing it into what's called a scripted series.
Yeah. Well, I was about to say, you got to have a series because, we're on episode 4 or 5 and we talk about something different every time.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. And like I said, and then, you haven't, with respect to the ecstasy, you haven't touched really on the Israelis, the Chinese, the Japanese, because we started exporting it to Japan, exporting it to Mexico. We sold a ton of ecstasy. Just because, the ecstasy markets are structured around party cities. So while here in the United States, LA, Chicago, New York were the biggest markets, but the second tier markets were not the cities you would think. Miami was much higher than Atlanta or Houston, Las Vegas, Honolulu, and of course, Mexico has a number of these cities, Cancun, Cabo, Vallarta. And so a lot of ecstasy ended up going south, a lot of ecstasy getting distributed all over the United States. And so, but I did want to answer your questions about the genesis of the rave scene, because by the time the riots came around in 92, put it this way, the DEA tried ambushing me and my buddy Jay in February of 92. So we took off, this is like a mad dash for better part of the next year. They tried arresting me twice in Phoenix. They tried arresting me in Chicago. They tried arresting Jay in Chicago. They tried arresting him once in Cleveland. They're chasing us all over the country. They actually had him in handcuffs at the airport at LAX. He talked his way out. He gave him the fake ID. He had his phony DD-214. He had all his.
I think that's going to be our next episode. Just the looting from the law enforcement.
Yeah, and so but the end of the rave scene really happened with the riots, only because that changed the dynamics between law enforcement and the party community. Also, you had that same spring, there was nothing to do with ecstasy at all, but nitrous oxide had gotten popular. Mm-hmm. And, it was actually unfortunate because it had even nothing to do with raves. There was a party in Hollywood, a nightclub in Hollywood that had started throwing a rave night. And these guys had gone to that rave night. They'd taken nitrous oxide and they unalived. And so even though it wasn't a rave, even though it had nothing to do with ecstasy, the authorities used that as a mechanism to say raves are killing, unaliving people, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so things changed that summer of 92. Now, if you want to say what was the heyday of the rave scene, you know, the underground clubs from 89 to 90, the underground raves from 90 to 92. Even after that, it was smaller you know, like put this way, unless they were in auditoriums, like that spring, there was a rave that had like 6,000 people, 7,000 people,
Mm-hmm.
you know, but again, nothing outlaw about that, nothing edgy. You know, they rented fucking Shriners Auditorium.
Yeah.
But from a marketing perspective for ecstasy, enormous market.
Mm-hmm.
But that was the death knell of the underground rave scene. From that point forward, it was commercial pop. It was mostly Orange County girls, you know, San Fernando Valley girls. Gone were the days of the smoking hot strippers,
Yeah.
you know, and just a very different scene, which later on, of course, became what it is today with EDM.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but the genesis of that happened in Los Angeles, where you had, you know, 3,000 people, 4,000 people, 6,000 people, and people began to realize that, hey, this could be taken to a level that you see now where, you know, you have 100,000, 200,000 people festivals in Vegas.
Right. Yeah, they just had one back, I think, earlier this month in March. It was like a 3-day festival out there, rave style thing. I forgot the name of it, but even people that I know here in South Carolina went to it.
Yeah, you know, well, you know, the 3-day rave is something that was very popular in Europe. Like the guys on the Beverly Hills side of the operation, they'd go to Ibiza for like a 3-day bender. They'd go to Greece for, you know, some 3-day island rave. You know, there was a famous rave in May of 90 in Manchester, like that kicked off what was called Generation E, you know, for ecstasy.
Yeah.
And, you know, they all went to that. You know, like for me, like I said, believe me, when I thought ecstasy was revolutionary.
Mm-hmm.
And we were essentially, you know, like the zealotry of religious converts.
Mm-hmm.
But I never really became too part of their culture, only because I didn't like the style of clothing. I didn't particularly care for, you know, the more wholesome women.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? You already got a good girlfriend. You're looking for the side piece that's smoking hot. You're not looking for another good girlfriend.
Right.
And so, you know, and of course the music was, but it was a very different scene. But no, obviously looking back, it was something that was extraordinary. I had friends that made a lot of money in the rave scene. You know, one of them built out a beautiful, you know, clothing company, you know, catering to the ravers. And so, you know, a very interesting experience. And I wanted to share that with you because you watch a lot of the episodes on YouTube and stuff where they're talking about guys who got involved with raving in the 90s and 97 or 98.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, you weren't there in 88 and 89.
Yeah. When it was really,
you know what I mean? And that's where it was really gritty. And it was something that was really special because once it got to the point where you're renting out Knott's Berry Farm, you know, it was professional party promoters making a lot of money.
Yeah.
But it wasn't people who were true to the culture.
Yeah.
And so
I think that's a good place to end it, man. Pete, fantastic interview as always. We enjoy having these conversations. We're going to have a lot more. I think what you were talking about looting authorities could be one of the next one we hop on, because that's always fun talks. I love people getting away and nearly getting caught, managed to getting away.
Well, it's unfortunate. Had I gotten knocked off in February of 92, I'd have gotten to 5 years rather than the 30 years. But yeah, we can get together and we'll share some of those stories.
All right. Sounds good, buddy. We'll see you next time.